12-year-old murders his grandmother. Then judge delivers a shocking sentence. 12 years old. That's how young he was when he stabbed his grandmother 47 times. 47. The woman who fed him every morning, who tucked him into bed every night, who chose him over her own freedom. And when the judge asked if he felt any remorse, he laughed. Actually laughed. Right there in open court, while her blood-stained sweater sat in an evidence bag 10 feet away. He thought being a child made him untouchable, that the system would protect him because of his age. He even winked at his lawyer when they read the charges. But what happened next left the entire courtroom frozen in disbelief, because this judge was about to make history. And that smirk, it was about to be wiped off his face forever. Stories like this remind us that justice always finds its way. If you believe in accountability, subscribe now and tell us what you think below. This is how it all began. The house stood quiet on Maple Street, a small, neat home with flower boxes in the windows and a porch swing that creaked in the breeze. For 30 years, Margaret Chen had lived there. She was 63, a retired school teacher with soft gray hair and hands that never stopped moving, always knitting, always baking, always caring. Her neighbors knew her as the woman who brought cookies to block parties and never missed a Sunday at church. But inside that house, behind those cheerful curtains, a darkness had been growing, a darkness that wore the face of a child, her grandson, the boy she had raised as her own when his parents couldn't, the boy who would repay her kindness with unspeakable violence. And on a cold Tuesday morning in March, that darkness would finally consume her. Margaret Chen wasn't supposed to be raising a child at 63. She had already raised her own children, watched them grow, make mistakes, and eventually build lives of their own. Her daughter Susan had struggled with substance issues for years, cycling through rehab programs and broken promises. And when Susan gave birth to a son, it became clear within months that she couldn't care for him. So Margaret did what she had always done. She stepped in. She took the baby into her home, into her heart, and raised him as if he were her second chance at motherhood. She never complained, not once. Her neighbors on Maple Street remembered Margaret as the kind of woman who made the world softer. Every morning she would sit on her porch with a cup of tea, waving at joggers and dog walkers. She knew everyone's names, asked about their children, remembered birthdays. Her garden was immaculate, roses in the spring, chrysanthemums in the fall. Inside her home, the walls were covered with family photographs, hand-stitched quilts draped over furniture, and the smell of vanilla candles mixed with whatever she was baking that day. It was the kind of house that felt like a hug the moment you walked through the door. But Margaret's real pride was her grandson. She talked about him constantly, how smart he was, how he loved building things with his hands, how he would sit with her while she knitted and tell her about his day at school. She enrolled him in the local middle school, helped him with homework every night, packed his lunches with little notes that said, "I love you," tucked inside. She sacrificed her retirement savings to buy him new clothes, a computer for schoolwork, basketball shoes when he made the team. She never asked for anything in return. Love, to Margaret, wasn't transactional. It was unconditional, endless, pure. Her sister Patricia lived 2 streets over and visited 3 times a week. They would sit in Margaret's kitchen, drinking coffee and talking about everything from church gossip to recipe ideas. Patricia noticed changes in the boy over the past year. He had become withdrawn, sullen. He stopped hugging Margaret when he came home from school. He spent hours locked in his room, refusing to come out even for dinner. When Patricia mentioned it, Margaret would smile and wave it off. "He's just becoming a teenager," she would say. "Boys go through phases." But Patricia saw something in his eyes that troubled her, something cold, something empty. She tried to warn her sister, but Margaret refused to believe that the child she loved could ever hurt her. The last time Patricia saw Margaret alive was on a Sunday afternoon. They had just come back from church and Margaret was making her famous apple pie. The boy was upstairs in his room, door closed, music playing loud enough to shake the ceiling. Margaret talked about taking him to the coast for spring break, about how she wanted to show him the ocean, teach him to appreciate the simple beauty of life. Patricia remembered watching her sister's face light up as she spoke, flour dusting her hands, joy radiating from every word. That was Margaret. Even when life was hard, even when the people around her failed, she chose love. She chose hope. And in 3 days, that choice would cost her everything. Margaret Chen had no idea that the boy sleeping under her roof was planning her death, that he had been searching online for ways to cover up a crime, that he had been watching her routines, memorizing when she went to bed, calculating how long it would take for someone to find her body. She didn't know that the child she had sacrificed everything for saw her not as a grandmother, but as an obstacle, an annoyance, a problem to be solved. And on the morning of March 14th, when she woke up up to make him breakfast like she did every single day. She had no idea it would be the last thing she ever did. The house on Maple Street would soon become a crime scene. The porch swing would stop creaking, the flower boxes would wilt, and the woman who had given everything to a boy who gave nothing back would be found in a pool of her own blood. 47 stab wounds marking the map of his rage. Margaret Chen deserved better. She deserved to grow old in peace, to watch sunsets from her porch, to be surrounded by the love she had spent a lifetime giving. Instead, she became a cautionary tale, a reminder that sometimes the people we love most are the ones capable of hurting us the deepest. And the boy who did this? He was about to learn that mercy has limits, that age is not a shield, and that some sins are too great to forgive. The call came in at 7:43 on a Tuesday morning. A neighbor, Mrs. Donna Friedman, had noticed that Margaret's newspapers were piling up on the porch. 3 days' worth. That wasn't like Margaret. She was meticulous about her routines, always up at dawn, always collecting the paper with her morning tea. Donna had knocked on the door Monday afternoon and gotten no answer. She tried again Tuesday morning. Still nothing. A feeling of dread settled in her stomach. She walked around to the back of the house and peered through the kitchen window. What she saw made her scream so loud that 2 other neighbors came running. Through the glass, she could see a hand, pale, motionless, lying in a dark pool that had spread across the kitchen floor. When police arrived, they found the back door unlocked. Officer Raymond Torres entered first, his hand on his weapon, calling out to announce his presence. The smell hit him immediately. Metallic, sweet, the unmistakable scent of death. He moved through the hallway, past family photos smiling down from the walls, past the living room where a half-finished quilt lay draped over the couch. And then he saw her. Margaret Chen was lying face down on the kitchen floor, her body twisted at an unnatural angle. Blood had pooled around her, soaking into the tiles, splattered across the cabinets, smeared on the refrigerator door. Her gray hair was matted with dried blood. Her hands were positioned as if she had tried to shield herself. Officer Torres had seen violence before, but this was different. This was rage. This was overkill. The forensic team arrived within the hour. They moved through the house like ghosts, documenting every detail, photographing every angle. The kitchen told a story of terror. Margaret had been attacked from behind while standing at the stove. A pot of oatmeal sat burned and crusted on the burner, still turned on. She had been making breakfast when it happened. The medical examiner counted 47 stab wounds on her body. 47. Concentrated on her back, neck, and shoulders. Defensive wounds covered her hands and forearms where she had tried to fight back. The weapon was found in the sink, partially washed, but still covered in blood. A kitchen knife from Margaret's own drawer. The handle had been wiped, but not well enough. Fingerprints were visible even to the naked eye. Detective Sarah Mendoza took lead on the case. She was a 20-year veteran with a reputation for thoroughness and an intolerance for violence against the vulnerable. As she walked through the scene, she noted details that painted a picture of Margaret's final moments. A chair had been knocked over near the table. A coffee mug lay shattered on the floor. Margaret's reading glasses were found several feet from her body, suggesting she had been moving, trying to escape. There were no signs of forced entry, no ransacked drawers or missing valuables. Margaret's purse sat untouched on the counter, $73 still inside. This wasn't a robbery. This was personal. This was someone who knew her, someone she trusted enough to let into her home, or someone who already lived there. Detective Mendoza noticed a second set of dishes in the sink, 2 plates from dinner the night before, 2 glasses. Margaret hadn't been alone. She asked the responding officers about other occupants, and that's when she learned about the grandson, a 12-year-old boy who lived with Margaret full-time. The officers hadn't seen him at the scene. His bedroom door upstairs had been closed when they arrived. Mendoza felt her pulse quicken. She climbed the stairs slowly, her hand resting on her sidearm. The hallway was lined with more family photos. Margaret smiling. The boy as a toddler, then older still. His most recent school picture showed a thin face with dark eyes that seemed to look through the camera rather than at it. She knocked on his bedroom door. No answer. She knocked again, harder this time, announcing herself as police. Still nothing. She tried the handle, locked from the inside. She called for backup and they forced the door open. The room was empty. The bed was made. Clothes hung neatly in the closet. A laptop sat closed on the desk. The window was open, curtains fluttering in the morning morning breeze. He was gone. And in that moment, Detective Mendoza knew with absolute certainty that this 12-year-old boy hadn't just witnessed his grandmother's death. He had caused it. The only question now was why, and where he had run to. The forensic team processed his room with painstaking care. They found drawings hidden under his mattress, violent sketches of people being hurt, stabbed, bleeding. Some of the figures were labeled. One said "Grandma" in childlike handwriting. They found his phone in a drawer, deliberately left behind but not destroyed. When they accessed it, they found search history that made their blood run cold. How to get away with murder. How long before a body is found? Do kids go to jail? He had been planning this. A 12-year-old child had researched, prepared, and executed the murder of the woman who loved him most. And then he had run, but he hadn't run far. At 2:15 that afternoon, a patrol car spotted him at a gas station 6 miles from the house. He was buying candy and soda with cash from his pocket, acting as if nothing had happened. When officers approached, he didn't resist. He didn't cry or panic or ask for a lawyer. He just smiled. That same empty smile that would later haunt everyone. Who saw it? They asked him where he had been. He shrugged. They asked him about his grandmother. He said he didn't know anything. And when they told him she was dead, that smile never faltered, not even for a second. He looked at them with eyes that held no fear, no sadness, no humanity. And in that moment, every officer present knew they were dealing with something they had never encountered before. A child without a conscience. A killer without remorse. The interrogation room at the precinct was designed to be uncomfortable. Hard chairs, fluorescent lights that buzzed overhead, a metal table bolted to the floor. But the boy who sat across from Detective Mendoza seemed perfectly at ease. He swung his legs back and forth, too short to reach the ground, and stared at the two-way mirror like he was watching television. His name was Ethan Cole, though the detectives had been instructed to refer to him only as the juvenile in official reports. He was small for 12, barely 5 feet tall, with shaggy brown hair that fell into his eyes. He looked like he should be at recess, trading Pokemon cards and complaining about homework. Instead, he was being questioned for murder. Detective Mendoza sat down and placed a folder on the table between them. She had interviewed hundreds of suspects over her career, but this felt different. Usually there was fear, anxiety, some kind of emotional response. Ethan showed nothing. He barely looked at her. She started with soft questions, trying to build rapport. Asked him about school, about his hobbies, about his favorite video games. He answered in short sentences, his voice flat and monotone. When she finally mentioned his grandmother, his expression didn't change. She asked him when he had last seen Margaret. He said Sunday night. She asked what they had for dinner. He said spaghetti. She asked if they had argued about anything. He said no. Every answer delivered with the same eerie calmness. Then she showed him a photograph. Margaret's body at the crime scene, covered with a sheet but still recognizable. Some people would call this tactic harsh, especially with a child. But Mendoza needed to see his reaction, needed to know if there was anything human left inside him. Ethan looked at the photo for 3 seconds. Then he looked back at the mirror. No tears, no shock, no emotion whatsoever. Mendoza felt a chill run down her spine. She had seen hardened criminals break down at the sight of their victims. But this child, this little boy who should have been crying for his grandmother, showed nothing. She asked him directly if he knew what had happened to Margaret. He shrugged and said maybe someone broke in. His voice held no conviction. It was a rehearsed line delivered badly. The forensic evidence told a different story. The fingerprints on the knife handle matched Ethan's perfectly. His prints were also found on the refrigerator handle, the kitchen counter, and the door frame leading to the back door. Blood. Spatter analysis showed that the attacker had been approximately 5 feet tall, striking downward at Margaret, who had been bent over the stove. The angle and force of the wounds were consistent with someone young but driven by intense fury. 47 stab wounds required stamina, required commitment. This wasn't a single moment of rage. This was sustained, deliberate violence. And the forensic timeline confirmed that Margaret had been attacked Monday morning, around the time Ethan would have been getting ready for school. His shoes told the story he refused to speak. Found in his closet, they had been wiped clean, but traces of Margaret's blood remained in the treads. Luminol testing revealed bloody footprints leading from the kitchen to the stairs, then into Ethan's bedroom. He had walked through his grandmother's blood, tracked it through the house, and then attempted to clean up. His clothes from Monday were found stuffed in a trash bag at the bottom of his hamper. Forensic testing confirmed Margaret's blood on the shirt, mixed with his own. He had cut himself during the attack, probably on the hand, though he had bandaged it well enough that it was barely visible now. Every piece of evidence pointed to the same conclusion. Ethan Cole had murdered his grandmother, and he had tried to cover it up, but the most damning evidence came from his phone. Despite leaving it behind, Ethan hadn't thought fought to delete his search history. Detectives recovered queries dating back 3 weeks. How to clean up blood. Can fingerprints be washed off? What happens to kids who kill someone? Do 12-year-olds go to adult prison? The searches painted a picture of premeditation. This wasn't a spontaneous act. This was planned, calculated. He had spent weeks thinking about it, researching it, preparing for it. And then, on a Monday morning, while Margaret made him breakfast like she had done 1,000 times before, he had picked up a knife and ended her life. There were text messages too, conversations with a friend from school, another 12-year-old named Marcus. In those messages, Ethan had complained about his grandmother constantly, called her annoying, said she was always in his business, always asking questions, always trying to control him. He wrote that he wished she would just disappear, that his life would be better without her. Marcus had responded with typical kid stuff, telling him to chill out, that all adults were annoying, but Ethan's messages grew darker. 3 days before the murder, he had texted Marcus saying, "I'm gonna do something about it." Marcus had sent back a laughing emoji, thinking it was a joke. It wasn't. The detective team also found a journal hidden in Ethan's desk drawer. The entries were sporadic, written in messy handwriting that slanted across the pages. Most of it was typical adolescent angst, complaints about homework, frustration about not having the newest gaming console. But scattered throughout were entries about Margaret. He wrote about how she embarrassed him in front of his friends, how she made him go to church when he didn't want to, how she wouldn't let him stay up late or play violent video games. Normal grandmother rules, normal boundaries. But to Ethan, they were unforgivable offenses. In his final entry, dated 2 days before the murder, he had written 5 words that made the entire investigative team go silent. "She won't control me anymore." Detective Mendoza brought the journal into the interrogation room and placed it in front of Ethan. She asked him if he recognized it. He glanced at it and nodded. She opened it to the last entry and asked him to read it out loud. He refused. She read it for him, her voice steady, but her hands trembling slightly. When she finished, she looked directly into his eyes and asked him one simple question. "Did you hurt your grandmother, Ethan?" The room went silent. The fluorescent lights buzzed. Somewhere down the hall, a phone was ringing. And then, for the first time since they had brought him in, Ethan Cole smiled. Not a nervous smile, not an uncertain smile, a cold, calculated smile that reached his lips but never touched his eyes. And he said, in a voice barely above a whisper, "She deserved it." The confession changed everything. The moment those 3 words left Ethan's mouth, the entire trajectory of the case shifted. Detective Mendoza immediately stopped the interrogation and called for the juvenile prosecutor. Within an hour, child psychologists and legal advocates filled the precinct. Everyone wanted to understand the same thing. How does a 12-year-old child become capable of such calculated violence? What happens in the mind of someone so young that allows them to stab their own grandmother 47 times and feel nothing? The answers, as they began to emerge, were more disturbing than anyone had anticipated. Dr. Vanessa Hartman was brought in to evaluate Ethan. She was a clinical psychologist specializing in juvenile behavioral disorders, with over 15 years of experience working with troubled youth. She had assessed children who had witnessed trauma, children who had acted out violently, children who struggled with impulse control. But within the first 30 minutes of speaking with Ethan, she realized this was different. He wasn't a child reacting to abuse or neglect. He wasn't lashing out from pain or fear. He was something far more chilling. He was a child who fundamentally lacked empathy, who saw other people not as human beings with feelings and value, but as objects that either served his needs or stood in his way. During the evaluation, Dr. Hartman asked Ethan to describe his relationship with his grandmother. He talked about her in purely functional terms. She made him food. She drove him places. She gave him money for things he wanted. When Dr. Hartman asked if he loved her, he looked confused, as if the question didn't make sense. He said he guessed so, but couldn't explain what that meant. When she asked how he felt about her death, he shrugged and said it didn't really matter. She was old anyway. She would have died eventually. The casual cruelty of his words, delivered without malice or emotion, sent chills through everyone present. This wasn't a child struggling with guilt. This was a child who genuinely didn't understand why what he had done was wrong. Dr. Hartman reviewed Ethan's history extensively. She interviewed his teachers, his former caseworkers, his mother, who was now 2 years sober and devastated by what her son had done. A pattern emerged that people had missed or dismissed as typical childhood behavior. When Ethan was 6, he had killed the family cat by putting it in the dryer. He told Margaret it was an accident, that he didn't know it would hurt the animal. At 8, he had been caught stealing money from Margaret's purse repeatedly. When confronted, he had blamed other kids from school. At 10, a neighbor reported seeing him throw rocks at a dog until it bled. Again, he had a ready excuse. The dog dog had been barking too much. Each incident alone seemed manageable, a troubled kid acting out. But together they painted a picture of escalating violence and complete absence of remorse. His teachers described him as intelligent but manipulative. He would turn in perfect homework assignments and then bully smaller kids on the playground when adults weren't looking. He was charming when he needed to be, able to smile and say the right things to get out of trouble. But classmates told a different story. They said Ethan was mean, that he would hurt people and then laugh about it, that he scared them because his eyes were empty, like looking at a doll instead of a person. One girl in his class told investigators that Ethan had once whispered to her that he could make her disappear and no one would know it was him. She had been too afraid to tell anyone. Now she wished she had. What disturbed Dr. Hartman most was Ethan's complete lack of anxiety about his situation. Most children, even those who had committed serious crimes, showed fear about consequences, fear of punishment, fear of losing their freedom, fear of disappointing their families. Ethan showed none of that. When she explained that he could spend the rest of his life in prison, he asked if they had video games there. When she told him that his grandmother's family was heartbroken, he said that wasn't his problem. He seemed to view the entire situation as an inconvenience rather than a tragedy, as if he had been caught breaking a minor rule rather than taking a human life. Dr. Hartman's preliminary diagnosis was conduct disorder with callous and unemotional traits. In clinical terms, it meant Ethan displayed a pattern of behavior that violated the rights of others without remorse. The callous, unemotional component was particularly significant. It indicated a lack of empathy, shallow emotions, and a failure to show guilt. Some experts would later argue that this was the childhood presentation of psychopathy, though that term couldn't be officially applied to someone so young. Regardless of the label, the conclusion was the same. Ethan Cole was dangerous. He had no internal brake that stopped him from hurting others, no conscience that made him feel bad about causing pain, and perhaps most terrifying, he had demonstrated a capacity for planning and deception that was sophisticated beyond his years. The prosecutor's office faced a monumental decision. Ethan was 12 years old. The juvenile justice system was designed for rehabilitation, built on the belief that children could change, could learn, could grow into better people. But what do you do with a child who shows no capacity for change, who views murder not as a moral failing, but as a practical solution? The law said he was a juvenile. Science said he was still developing, but the evidence said he was a calculated killer who would do it again if given the chance. His own words confirmed it. When Dr. Hartman asked him if he would hurt someone else if he got angry, he didn't say no. He didn't promise to be better. He just smiled that empty smile and said, "Probably." The case file grew thicker by the day. Witness statements, psychological evaluations, forensic reports. And at the center of it all was a 12-year-old boy who had stabbed his grandmother 47 times and felt nothing. Margaret's sister Patricia gave a statement that broke the hearts of everyone who read it. She said Margaret had loved that boy more than anything in the world, had sacrificed her golden years to give him a stable home, had believed with her whole heart that love could save anyone. But love hadn't saved Ethan. It hadn't changed him or softened him or made him better. And in the end, that unconditional love had gotten Margaret killed. The question now was whether justice could do what love had failed to accomplish, whether the system could protect society from a child who had already proven he was willing to kill. The courtroom was packed on the first day of the hearing. News cameras lined the hallway outside, reporters jostling for position, their voices echoing off the marble walls. This wasn't just another juvenile case. This was national news. A 12-year-old charged with first-degree murder of his own grandmother. The question on everyone's mind wasn't whether he had done it. The evidence was overwhelming. The question was, what would happen to him? Would he be tried as a juvenile and released at 21? Would he be transferred to adult court and face life in prison? The courtroom felt electric with tension as people filed in, filling every seat, standing against the back wall when there was no room left. Judge Marion Brenner entered at precisely 9 o'clock. She was 68 years old, a former prosecutor with a reputation for being fair but firm. She had presided over difficult cases before, but nothing quite like this. As she took her seat, she looked out over the courtroom. Margaret's family sat on the left side. Patricia, the sister, had her hands folded in her lap, her face drawn and pale. Other relatives surrounded her, some crying quietly, others staring straight ahead with expressions of barely controlled rage. On the right side sat Ethan's mother, Susan. She looked broken, diminished, as if the weight of what her son had done was physically crushing her. And in the center, at the defense table, sat Ethan Cole. He was dressed in clothes his public defender had chosen, a button-down shirt, khaki pants, an attempt to make him look like a child, innocent and small, but the illusion shattered the moment you looked at his face. He wasn't crying, he wasn't scared, he was bored. He leaned back in his chair, spinning a pencil between his fingers, occasionally glancing around the courtroom like he was waiting for something more interesting to happen. When Judge Brenner called the court to order, Ethan didn't straighten up or show respect. He just kept spinning that pencil, a small smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. The prosecution was led by Assistant District Attorney Michael Reeves, a man known for his methodical approach and his ability to stay calm under pressure. He stood and addressed the court, outlining the charges: first-degree murder, premeditation, extreme cruelty. He walked the judge through the evidence systematically, the search history showing weeks of planning, the journal entries expressing his intent, the forensic evidence tying him directly to the scene, the 47 stab wounds that demonstrated not a moment of rage but sustained, deliberate violence, and finally, his own confession. 3 words that sealed his guilt beyond any doubt. She deserved it. Judge Brenner turned to Ethan and asked if he understood the charges against him. He nodded without looking up. She asked him to answer verbally for the record. He sighed as if she were wasting his time and said yes. She asked if he understood the seriousness of what he was accused of doing. He shrugged. Judge Brenner's jaw tightened. She had seen defiance before, but this was different. This was dismissal, as if the entire proceeding was beneath him. She asked him directly if he understood that his grandmother was dead because of his actions. Ethan finally looked up, making eye contact for the first time, and he smiled. Not nervously, not apologetically. He smiled like someone who had just been asked a stupid question. He said he understood. Then he went back to spinning his pencil. The defense attorney, a woman named Linda Marsh, had an impossible job. She was court-appointed, assigned to represent a client who showed no remorse and had essentially confessed. Her strategy was predictable but necessary. She would argue that Ethan was a child, that his brain wasn't fully developed, that he couldn't fully comprehend the consequences of his actions, that the juvenile system existed precisely for situations like this, to rehabilitate rather than punish. She stood and made her opening statement, her voice steady but lacking conviction. She talked about Ethan's difficult childhood, his mother's addiction, the instability he had faced. She painted him as a victim of circumstance, a boy who had never learned proper coping mechanisms. But her words rang hollow in a courtroom where everyone had seen the evidence, where everyone knew that Ethan hadn't killed in a moment of emotional chaos. He had planned it, researched it, executed it with chilling precision, and when Linda Marsh sat down, even she looked defeated. Because how do you defend the indefensible? How do you ask for mercy for someone who has shown none? Judge Brenner seemed to be thinking the same thing. She looked at Ethan for a long moment, studying him, trying to see past the small body and young face to whatever lay beneath. What she saw there made her expression harden. The victim impact statements came next. Patricia took the stand first, her hands shaking as she gripped the railing. She talked about her sister, about Margaret's kindness, her generosity, her endless capacity for love. She described how Margaret had taken in Ethan when no one else would, how she had given up her retirement, her freedom, her peace to raise him, how she had believed that love could fix anything, could heal anyone. Patricia's voice broke as she described the last time she saw Margaret alive, how happy her sister had been, how excited about the future, and then she turned to look directly at Ethan. She asked him why. Why would you hurt someone who loved you so much? Why would you take the one person who never gave up on you? Ethan looked back at her with those empty eyes. No tears, no shame, nothing. Patricia broke down completely, sobbing into her hands, and had to be helped from the stand. Other family members followed. A cousin who talked about Margaret's laugh, a nephew who remembered her cooking. Each statement painted a picture of a woman who had brought joy and light into the world, a woman who had been stolen from them by the very person she had tried to save. And through it all, Ethan sat unmoved. He didn't fidget. He didn't look away. He just watched with that same detached curiosity, as if he were observing something that had nothing to do with him. Then Susan took the stand, Ethan's mother. She looked at her son, and tears streamed down her face. She apologized to Margaret's family, said she didn't know how this had happened, that she had been a terrible mother but Margaret had been wonderful, that nothing made sense anymore. She turned to the judge and begged for mercy, said he was just a child, that he could change, that he needed help, not punishment. But even as she spoke, her voice wavered because she was looking at her son's face, seeing that smile, that emptiness, and somewhere deep inside, she knew the truth that she couldn't bring herself to say out loud. The boy sitting at that table wasn't the child she had given birth to. He was something else entirely, something that couldn't be fixed with therapy or time or love, something that perhaps had been broken from the very beginning. And when her testimony ended and she stepped down, Ethan didn't reach for her hand or offer her comfort. He just turned back to the judge and waited for what came next. Because in his mind, this was all just a formality, just another obstacle he would manipulate his way around. He had no idea how wrong he was. The evidence presentation began on day 3 of the hearing. The courtroom had thinned slightly, some spectators unable to stomach the gruesome details, but the core remained. Margaret's family, the media, legal observers who understood they were witnessing something extraordinary. Assistant District Attorney Reeves stood before a large monitor, ready to walk the court through every damning piece of evidence. He started with the timeline, reconstructing the final hours of Margaret Chen's life with precision that made the horror feel immediate and real. Monday morning, 6:15. Margaret's alarm goes off. Security footage from a neighbor's doorbell camera shows her retrieving the newspaper from her porch at 6:23, wearing her bathrobe and slippers, her gray hair uncombed. She waves at the camera, a habit she had developed over the years. That wave, frozen on the screen, felt like a ghost reaching out from the past. She had no idea she had 40 minutes left to live. Inside her house, she followed her routine, made coffee, started preparing oatmeal on the stove, Ethan's favorite breakfast. The prosecution entered into evidence a receipt from the grocery store dated 3 days earlier. Margaret had bought brown sugar, raisins, and cinnamon specifically for him. Even in death, the evidence of her love persisted. 6:57. Ethan's cell phone registered movement, the accelerometer data showing he had gotten out of bed. The prosecution presented technical evidence from his device. The phone had been connected to the home Wi-Fi network until 7:14, when it was deliberately powered down. But before that, at 7:02, there had been one final search query. How long does it take to bleed out? Those 6 words displayed on the courtroom monitor in stark black text made several people gasp. Ethan had Googled how long his grandmother would take to die, and then, 12 minutes later, he had killed her. The forensic photographs came next. Judge Brenner warned the courtroom that the images were graphic. Several family members left. Those who remained would later say they wished they hadn't. The photos showed Margaret's body from every angle. The medical examiner, Dr. Richard Yao, took the stand and walked through his findings with clinical detachment. 47 stab wounds, 23 to the back, 12 to the neck and shoulders, 8 to the arms and hands, defensive wounds, 4 to the head. The attack had lasted several minutes. Margaret had fought, had tried to protect herself, had tried to escape. The blood spatter patterns showed she had moved from the stove to the kitchen table, then toward the hallway, each step leaving a trail of her life draining away. Dr. Yao explained that several of the wounds had missed vital organs. They had caused pain and bleeding but hadn't been immediately fatal. Margaret had suffered, had known what was happening to her, had felt every single stab. The fatal wound had come last, a deep puncture to the side of her neck that severed her carotid artery. She had bled out in approximately 90 seconds, but those 90 seconds, following minutes of terror and agony, must have felt like an eternity. Judge Brenner closed her eyes briefly, steadying herself. When she opened them, she looked directly at Ethan. He was examining his fingernails, utterly disinterested. The prosecution then presented Ethan's own clothing, the shirt he had worn that day, sealed in a clear evidence bag. The white fabric was stained dark brown with dried blood. Not spatter, not drops. The entire front was soaked. Forensic analysis confirmed it was Margaret's blood. The concentration and distribution indicated that Ethan had been standing directly over her when the final wounds were inflicted, that he had been close enough to feel her blood spray onto him, close enough to hear her last breath, and he had stood there, at 12 years old, and watched his grandmother die. Then he had calmly walked upstairs, changed clothes, and attempted to hide the evidence. Detective Mendoza took the stand next, and presented the search history in its entirety. The courtroom listened in horrified silence as she read each query aloud. How to get away with murder? Can police trace deleted texts? Do kids kids go to jail for killing someone? What happens if you kill a family member? How to clean blood off floors? How long before a dead body smells? Each search was time-stamped, creating a clear progression of intent. This wasn't curiosity. This wasn't a child exploring dark topics online. This was research, preparation, planning, and it had begun 3 weeks before Margaret's death. But the most devastating evidence was yet to come. The prosecution called Marcus Chen to the stand. No relation to Margaret, just an unfortunate coincidence of last names. He was Ethan's best friend from school, a quiet 12-year-old boy who looked terrified to be in court. He had been granted immunity in exchange for his testimony. His mother sat behind him, her hand on his shoulder as he was sworn in. ADA Reeves approached gently, understanding that this child was also a victim in his own way. A victim of betrayal, of being drawn into darkness by someone he had trusted. Marcus testified that Ethan had told him about planning to hurt his grandmother. At first Marcus thought he was joking. Ethan was always saying dramatic stuff, trying to sound tough. But 2 weeks before the murder, Ethan had shown him the journal, had read aloud the entries about wanting Margaret gone. Marcus had told him to stop being weird, that it wasn't funny. Ethan had just laughed and said he was serious, that his grandmother was ruining his life, that she deserved what was coming. Marcus admitted, his voice barely above a whisper, that he hadn't told anyone, hadn't believed Ethan would actually do it. The guilt in his young face was palpable. He would carry this burden for the rest of his life. Then came the text messages. ADA Reeves displayed them on the monitor, the conversation thread between Ethan and Marcus from the day of the murder. 7:28 a.m. Ethan had sent a message. "I did it," Marcus had responded. "Did what?" Ethan replied, "What I said I would do. She's gone." Marcus wrote back, "Stop lying, that's not funny." Ethan sent 3 words. "I'm not lying." Then silence. Marcus had stared at his phone during first period social studies, his stomach churning, not knowing what to do. By the time he got home and told his mother, police had already arrested Ethan. The text messages proved consciousness of guilt, proved that Ethan knew what he had done was wrong, even if he felt no remorse about it. The final piece of evidence was the interrogation video. The court watched in real time as Detective Mendoza questioned Ethan, watched him lie, deflect, and eventually confess. The camera captured every micro-expression, every shift in his posture. Most chilling was the moment after his confession. When the detective asked him why he had done it, Ethan had leaned forward, looked directly into the camera, and said something that hadn't been in the official reports, something the detective had kept sealed until this moment. He said, "Because I wanted to see what it felt like. Not anger, not revenge, not even mercy for someone he thought was suffering. He had killed his grandmother out of curiosity, to experience what it was like to take a life." The courtroom erupted. Patricia screamed. Ethan's mother collapsed in her seat, sobbing uncontrollably. The judge had to call for order, her gavel striking 3 times before the chaos subsided. And through it all, Ethan sat perfectly still. That small smile had returned. He looked pleased, as if he had finally said something that got the reaction he wanted. He had shocked them, made them understand that he wasn't like other children, that he was special in the worst possible way. And in that moment, everyone present understood that this wasn't about rehabilitation. This wasn't about second chances or the capacity for change. This was about protecting society from someone who viewed human life as nothing more than an experiment, a child who had killed for entertainment and would absolutely do it again if given the opportunity. The prosecution called Dr. Vanessa Hartman to the stand on the 4th day of the hearing. The courtroom had taken on a different energy. The initial shock had given way to a grim understanding that they were witnessing something rare and deeply disturbing. Dr. Hartman carried a thick file to the witness stand, her expression neutral, but her eyes betrayed the weight of what she was about to share. She had spent dozens of hours evaluating Ethan Cole, conducting psychological tests, reviewing his history, trying to find some explanation for how a child becomes a killer. What she had discovered offered no comfort. Dr. Hartman explained to the court that she had administered a comprehensive battery of psychological assessments, the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory adapted for adolescents, the Psychopathy Checklist Youth version, cognitive function tests, emotional recognition exercises. The results painted a consistent picture across every measure. Ethan demonstrated extremely low empathy, virtually no anxiety about consequences, superficial charm when it suited him, and a grandiose sense of self-worth. He genuinely believed he was smarter than everyone around him, that rules didn't apply to him, that he was special enough to do whatever he wanted without real repercussions. One test particularly stood out. Dr. Hartman had shown Ethan a series of photographs depicting people in various emotional states: pain, fear, sadness, joy. Most children, even those with behavioral problems, could identify these emotions and showed some physiological response when viewing images of suffering, elevated heart rate, pupil dilation, micro-expressions of discomfort. Ethan had identified the emotions correctly, proving he intellectually understood them, but his physiological responses were flat. When shown an image of a child crying in pain, his heart rate hadn't changed. His expression remained neutral. He understood the concept of suffering but didn't feel anything about it. It was like showing color photographs to someone who had only ever seen the world in black and white. Dr. Hartman testified that this lack of effective empathy was particularly concerning in someone so young. The human brain continues developing into the mid-20s, particularly the prefrontal cortex responsible for impulse control and moral reasoning. Most experts held hope that juvenile offenders could change as their brains matured, but Ethan's case was different. His deficit wasn't in the reasoning centers of his brain, it was in the emotional centers, the parts that made humans feel connected to each other, that created the internal discomfort we call guilt or shame. Those centers appeared fundamentally underdeveloped or absent, and there was no therapy, no medication, no intervention that could create empathy where the biological capacity for it didn't exist. The defense attorney, Linda Marsh, cross-examined Dr. Hartman with visible reluctance. She asked if Ethan's difficult early childhood could have contributed to his psychological state. Dr. Hartman acknowledged that early trauma could impact emotional development, but she emphasized that most children who experience neglect or instability don't become killers. They develop anxiety, depression, attachment issues. They don't meticulously plan the murder of someone who loved them. Ethan's pathology went beyond trauma response. It was something intrinsic, something that had likely been present from birth and was merely revealed over time as his capacity for violence grew. Linda Marsh asked if there was any possibility of rehabilitation. Could intensive therapy help? Could a structured environment teach him empathy? Dr. Hartman paused before answering, choosing her words carefully. She said that therapeutic interventions could potentially teach someone like Ethan to intellectually understand social expectations, to mimic appropriate responses, to recognize that hurting others would result in punishment. But truly feeling empathy, genuinely valuing human life, experiencing remorse for causing pain, those weren't skills that could be taught. They were fundamental aspects of human emotional architecture, and in Ethan's case, that architecture was fatally flawed. She concluded by saying something that silenced the entire courtroom. "I have never, in my 15 years of practice, evaluated a child who frightened me. Until now." The prosecution then called Dr. Raymond Foster, a forensic psychiatrist who had reviewed the case independently. He corroborated Dr. Hartman's findings, but added another layer of concern. He testified that Ethan displayed traits consistent with what used to be called psychopathy, though that diagnosis couldn't be formally applied to juveniles. The key factor wasn't just the lack of empathy, it was the presence of predatory behavior. Ethan had identified his grandmother as a target, had planned her death methodically, had executed that plan without hesitation, and afterward had shown pride in his accomplishment. That pattern, planning-execution pride, was characteristic of predatory violence rather than reactive violence. Dr. Foster explained the difference. Most juvenile violence was reactive. A child loses control in a moment of anger or fear and lashes out. They feel terrible afterward. They wish they could take it back. Predatory violence was different. It was calculated, purposeful, and emotionally cold. The perpetrator selected their victim, planned the attack, and felt satisfaction in the outcome. Ethan's behavior fit the predatory pattern perfectly. He hadn't killed Margaret in a rage. He had killed her because she was convenient, vulnerable, and he wanted to experience what murder felt like. That made him exceptionally dangerous, because if he had killed once for curiosity, what would stop him from killing again? The defense called their own expert, Dr. Mitchell Green, a child psychologist who specialized in juvenile offenders. He argued that Ethan's brain was still developing, that the prefrontal cortex, responsible for impulse control and decision-making, wouldn't be fully mature until his mid-20s. That, placing a 12-year-old in adult prison would destroy any chance of normal development. That the juvenile system existed precisely for cases like this, offering structured rehabilitation and education. His testimony was earnest and well-meaning, But when ADA Reeves cross-examined him, the argument fell apart. Reeves asked Dr. Green if he had personally evaluated Ethan. He had not. He was speaking in general terms about juvenile brain development. Reeves asked if typical juveniles planned murders 3 weeks in advance. Dr. Green admitted that was unusual. Reeves asked if typical juveniles researched methods of avoiding detection. Again, unusual. Reeves asked if typical juveniles confessed to murder by saying they wanted to see what it felt like. Dr. Green shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He acknowledged that Ethan's case was atypical, that the level of premeditation and emotional detachment was rare, but he maintained that he was still a child deserving of a chance at rehabilitation. Then Reeves asked the question that had been hanging over the entire proceeding. Dr. Green, if Ethan Cole were released at age 21, as would happen under the juvenile system, would you feel comfortable having him as your neighbor? The courtroom went silent. Dr. Green opened his mouth to answer, then closed it. He looked at his notes, looked at the judge. Finally, quietly, he said, "I don't know." That moment of hesitation, that flicker of doubt, undermined his entire testimony, because even the expert arguing for rehabilitation couldn't honestly say that Ethan Cole would be safe to release into society. The psychological testimony concluded with a chilling assessment from Dr. Hartman, recalled by the prosecution. She stated that in her professional opinion, Ethan Cole represented an extreme risk for future violence, that his lack of remorse, combined with his demonstrated capacity for planning and deception, made him one of the most dangerous individuals she had ever evaluated. She noted that he had shown no emotional growth or insight throughout their sessions, no moment where he seemed to grasp the magnitude of what he had done. When she had asked him during their final session if he would change anything about that morning, he had thought for a moment and then said, "I would have cleaned up better." Not that he wouldn't have killed her, just that he would have been more thorough covering his tracks. That single statement, Dr. Hartman said, revealed everything the court needed to know about Ethan Cole. He didn't regret the murder. He only regretted getting caught, and that made him not just dangerous, but incurable. The defense knew they were losing. Every piece of evidence, every expert testimony, every moment of Ethan's cold indifference had painted a picture that was impossible to reframe. But Linda Marsh had a responsibility to her client, no matter how monstrous his actions. She had one strategy left: humanize him, show the court that beneath the empty eyes and calculated violence was still a child. A broken child, perhaps, but a child nonetheless. Someone who deserved the protections that society afforded to minors. Someone who could still be saved. It was a nearly impossible task, but she had to try. She called Susan Cole back to the stand. Ethan's mother looked even more fragile than she had during her victim impact statement. Her hands shook as she placed them on the Bible to be sworn in. Dark circles shadowed her eyes. She had barely slept since her son's arrest, barely eaten, barely functioned. The guilt of what her addiction had done, how it had shaped her son's early years, was eating her alive. Linda Marsh approached her gently, knowing this woman was as much a victim of Ethan's choices as anyone. She asked Susan to tell the court about Ethan's early childhood before Margaret took over his care. Susan's voice cracked as she spoke. She admitted she had been a terrible mother, that when Ethan was born, she was already deep into substance use, that she had chosen her next high over her baby's needs more times than she could count. She described leaving him alone in his crib for hours while she was passed out, forgetting to feed him, missing doctor appointments, being investigated by child services multiple times. By the time Ethan was 3, Margaret had stepped in, taking temporary custody that eventually became permanent. Susan went to rehab twice during those early years, failed both times. It wasn't until Ethan was 10 that she finally got sober and stayed that way. Linda Marsh asked if Susan had noticed behavioral problems when Ethan was young. Susan nodded, tears streaming down her face. He had been a difficult baby, didn't like being held, didn't respond to her voice or her touch. As a toddler, he rarely cried even when hurt, didn't seek comfort when scared. She had thought maybe he was just independent. Now she wondered if those early signs had been warning flags she was too impaired to recognize. She described an incident when Ethan was 4. He had pushed another child off a slide at the playground, breaking the child's arm. When Susan asked him why he did it, he had simply said the other kid was in his way. No apology, no understanding that he had hurt someone. The testimony was meant to generate sympathy, to show that Ethan had been shaped by circumstances beyond his control, but it was having the opposite effect. The courtroom listened to Susan's descriptions of her son's early callousness and saw not a victim of neglect, but a child who had been incapable of normal emotional connection from the beginning. Linda Marsh tried to redirect, asking Susan to describe any good memories with Ethan, any moments of warmth or connection. Susan struggled to answer. She talked about teaching him to ride a bike, but even that memory was hollow. He had learned quickly, then rode away without looking back at her. She mentioned birthdays, Christmas mornings, trips to the zoo, but in every memory, Ethan was distant, present physically, but absent emotionally. Then Linda Marsh asked the question she needed Susan to answer convincingly. "Do you believe your son can change?" Susan looked at Ethan, sitting at the defense table. He was watching her with mild interest, like she was a television show he was half paying attention to. Their eyes met, and in that moment, Susan saw her son clearly for the first time. Not as the baby she had failed, not as the child she had abandoned, but as the person he actually was. Empty, cold, unreachable. She opened her mouth to say yes, to say that of course he could change, that he was still young, that love and therapy could fix him. But the word wouldn't come. Instead, she broke down completely, sobbing so hard she couldn't speak. The judge called a recess. Susan was helped from the stand, her inability to defend her own son speaking volumes. The defense called several teachers who testified that Ethan had been an average student, never violent in the classroom, never disruptive. But under cross-examination, they all admitted the same thing. He had been odd, disconnected. One teacher described how Ethan had watched another student have an asthma attack without offering help or calling for assistance. He had just sat there observing. When asked later why he didn't help, he said it wasn't his problem. Another teacher mentioned that Ethan never seemed to have real friends. He had acquaintances, kids he would manipulate into doing his homework or sharing their lunch, but no genuine connections, no one who truly knew him or cared about him. Linda Marsh made her closing argument with visible exhaustion. She acknowledged that what Ethan had done was horrific, that Margaret's death was a tragedy beyond words, but she emphasized his age, 12 years old, still a child under the law, still developing, still theoretically capable of change. She argued that the juvenile justice system existed for exactly this reason, to give young offenders the chance to grow, to mature, to become different people than they were at their worst moment. She pointed out that adult prison would destroy any possibility of rehabilitation, that placing a 12-year-old among hardened adult criminals would only make him worse, that society had an obligation to at least try to save him. But even as she spoke, her words lacked conviction, because she had spent weeks with Ethan, had tried to prepare him for trial, had attempted to coach him on how to show remorse, how to appear sympathetic. He had looked at her like she was speaking a foreign language. He didn't understand why he should pretend to feel bad, didn't see the point in putting on a performance for the court. He genuinely believed he would be fine regardless, that his age was an impenetrable shield, that the system would protect him because that's what it was designed to do. Linda Marsh had met many young clients over her career. Some were guilty, some were innocent. but all of them were human. Until Ethan. There was something fundamentally missing in him, something that made him less a child and more a walking threat. She sat down, her closing argument complete but ultimately hollow. The defense had done everything possible within the bounds of the law. They had presented psychological context. They had highlighted his young age. They had emphasized the purpose of the juvenile system. But none of it could erase the central truth. Ethan Cole had murdered his grandmother with premeditation and sophistication that belied his years. He had shown no remorse, no growth, no capacity for change. And every expert who had evaluated him, even those sympathetic to juvenile offenders, had concluded the same thing. He was dangerous, irredeemably so. The question now was whether the law would recognize that reality or cling to the principle that children deserved second chances even when they had proven themselves incapable of using them wisely. Judge Brenner announced that closing arguments from the prosecution would begin the following morning. The court adjourned. As everyone filed out, Ethan turned to look at his mother one last time. Susan was being comforted by a victim advocate, her face buried in her hands. Ethan watched her cry with the same detached curiosity he showed everything else. Then he turned away, asking the bailiff if he could have a snack before being taken back to juvenile detention. Because to him, this was all just an inconvenience, an interruption to his life that he couldn't wait to move past. He had no idea that his life as he knew it was about to end forever, that the judge sitting silently at her bench was already making a decision that would shock the nation and redefine what justice meant for juvenile offenders. The next day would change everything. But Ethan Cole, in his infinite arrogance, had no idea what was coming. The courtroom filled early the next morning. Word had spread that the prosecution's closing argument would be delivered today, and people wanted to witness it. Assistant District Attorney Michael Reeves had built his reputation on moments like this. He didn't grandstand or perform for cameras. He presented facts with surgical precision, allowing the truth to speak for itself. But today felt different. Today, he carried the weight of Margaret Chen's memory, the grief of her family, and the responsibility of ensuring that justice wasn't sacrificed on the altar of misplaced mercy. When Judge Brenner called the court to order, Reeves stood and approached the center of the courtroom with a folder in his hand. He began quietly, almost conversationally. He talked about Margaret Chen, not as a victim or a crime statistic, but as a person. A woman who had taught elementary school for 30 years, shaping young minds and nurturing potential. A woman who went to church every Sunday and volunteered at the food bank every Thursday. A woman who took in her grandson when he had nowhere else to go, sacrificing her retirement and her peace to give him a stable home. He described her morning routine, how she made oatmeal with brown sugar and cinnamon because it was Ethan's favorite, how she had been standing at that stove, preparing breakfast for the boy she loved when he drove a knife into her back. Reeves turned to the evidence monitor and displayed a photograph. Margaret smiling at a family gathering, her arm around a younger Ethan, her face radiating warmth and love. Then he displayed the crime scene photo, the same woman lying dead on her kitchen floor in a pool of blood. The contrast was devastating. Several jurors looked away. Patricia Chen sobbed quietly in the gallery. Reeves let the silence stretch, allowing the weight of that juxtaposition to settle over everyone present. Then he spoke again, his voice harder now. He said that Margaret Chen had believed in second chances, had believed in redemption, had believed that love could save anyone, and that belief had gotten her killed. He walked through the evidence methodically, the search history proving premeditation, the journal entries revealing intent, the forensic evidence tying Ethan to every aspect of the crime, the confession where he admitted killing her because he wanted to see what it felt like. Reeves emphasized that final point. Not anger, not revenge, not even mercy. Curiosity. Ethan Cole had murdered his grandmother out of curiosity, the way someone might dissect a frog in biology class. That single fact revealed more about his character than anything else. He had no rage to excuse, no trauma to justify. He had killed because he wanted to know what it was like to watch someone die. And he had chosen the most vulnerable, most loving person in his life as his victim. Reeves addressed the defense's argument directly. Yes, Ethan was 12 years old. Yes, his brain was still developing. Yes, the juvenile justice system existed to rehabilitate young offenders. But rehabilitation required something fundamental. It required the capacity for change, the ability to recognize wrongdoing, feel remorse, and choose to be better. Ethan Cole possessed none of those abilities. Every expert who evaluated him, including the defense's own psychologist, had acknowledged his profound lack of empathy, his complete absence of remorse, his chilling indifference to the suffering he had caused. You cannot rehabilitate someone who doesn't believe they've done anything wrong. He posed a question to the court. What do we do when a child commits an adult crime with adult-level planning and adult-level cruelty? Do we close our eyes to the reality of what they are because of what we wish they could be? Do we release them back into society at 21, fully aware that they will likely hurt someone else, simply because we're uncomfortable treating a child as dangerous? Or do we have the courage to acknowledge that some individuals, regardless of age, pose a threat that cannot be managed through counseling and juvenile detention? Reeves argued that Ethan Cole had forfeited his right to be treated as a typical juvenile the moment he planned and executed a murder with such calculated precision. He displayed the text messages Ethan had sent to Marcus. "I did it. She's gone." Reeves pointed out the absence of panic or regret in those words. "No, I made a terrible mistake. No, I don't know what to do." Just cold declaration of accomplishment. Then he played a portion of the interrogation video. The moment where Ethan smiled after confessing. That empty, satisfied smile that had haunted everyone who had seen it. Reeves asked the court to look at that smile and honestly assess whether they believed the person wearing it could ever be trusted in society again. Whether any amount of therapy could create a conscience where none existed. Reeves turned to the question of sentencing. The defense had argued for juvenile court jurisdiction, which would mean Ethan would be released at 21 regardless of his progress or continued danger. 9 years. That was all Margaret Chen's life was worth under that scenario. 9 years for 47 stab wounds, 9 years for premeditated murder, 9 years for killing the woman who had loved him unconditionally. Reeves argued that such a sentence would be a mockery of justice, an insult to Margaret's memory, and most importantly, a guarantee that Ethan Cole would hurt someone else the moment he regained his freedom. He cited statistics. The recidivism rate for juvenile offenders with callous, unemotional traits was significantly higher than other young offenders. Studies showed that lack of empathy was the single best predictor of future violence. Treatment programs had minimal success with individuals who couldn't form emotional connections or understand moral consequences. Every data point supported the same conclusion. Ethan Cole would reoffend. Not might. Would. It was only a question of when and whom. Reeves asked if the court was willing to accept responsibility for the next victim. The next Margaret Chen who would die because they chose hope over evidence, principle over reality. He addressed the argument that adult prison would harm Ethan's development. Reeves acknowledged that adult facilities were harsh environments, but he pointed out that Ethan's development was already complete in the ways that mattered. His capacity for empathy, his moral framework, his ability to value human life, those weren't going to improve with age. The brain might continue developing, but you cannot build emotional architecture on a foundation that doesn't exist. Placing Ethan in juvenile detention wouldn't make him less dangerous. It would simply delay the inevitable while giving him access to younger, more vulnerable potential victims. Reeves's voice rose for the first time as he neared his conclusion. He said that justice wasn't about vengeance. It wasn't about punishment for punishment's sake. Justice was about protection, about ensuring that people could live their lives without fear of predators in their midst. Margaret Chen had opened her home to a predator because she believed he was a child who needed love. She had paid for that belief with her life. The question now was whether society would make the same mistake, whether they would release Ethan Cole because of his birth certificate rather than his actions, whether they would prioritize the theoretical redemption of one dangerous individual over the safety of countless potential future victims. He concluded with a simple statement. Margaret Chen believed in second chances right up until the moment her grandson stabbed her for the 47th time. She believed that children could be saved with enough love and patience. Her belief got her killed. This court has the opportunity to learn from her tragedy, to recognize that some people, regardless of age, are beyond saving. Not because we haven't tried hard enough, not because we lack compassion, but because they fundamentally lack the capacity for change. Ethan Cole has shown us exactly who he is. We should believe him, and we should protect society from him, not for 9 years, forever. The silence that followed was absolute. Reeves returned to his seat. Judge Brenner sat motionless, her expression unreadable. Margaret's family wept openly. Susan Cole stared at the floor, her face ashen. And Ethan? Ethan sat at the defense table, picking at a loose thread on his shirt, completely unmoved by the damning portrait that had just been painted of him. He glanced at the clock on the wall, clearly bored, clearly ready for this to be over so he could go back to his cell and play the video games they allowed in juvenile detention. He had no idea that his childhood, such as it was, had just ended, that Judge Brenner was about to make a decision that would reverberate through the juvenile justice system for years to come. A decision that would prove that sometimes the law must adapt to reality rather than forcing reality to conform to the law. The moment of reckoning had arrived. Judge Marion Brenner sat alone in her chambers after the closing arguments concluded. The courtroom had been dismissed for a 2-hour recess while she considered her decision. 2 hours to determine the fate of a 12-year-old boy who had committed an act of such calculated brutality that it defied every instinct she had about childhood and redemption. The law gave her options. She could keep the case in juvenile court, ensuring Ethan would be released at 21. Or she could transfer him to adult court, where he would face sentences typically reserved for hardened criminals. Neither option felt right, but one option felt necessary. She had been a judge for 19 years. Before that, a prosecutor for 12. In all that time, she had seen countless young offenders come through her courtroom. Kids who had made terrible mistakes in moments of rage or fear or desperation. Kids whose eyes still held some spark of humanity, some flicker of regret. She had sentenced many of them harshly when warranted, but she had always believed in the fundamental premise of juvenile justice, that children were different, that their brains were still forming, that they deserved the chance to become someone better than their worst moment. She still believed that. For most children. But Ethan Cole wasn't most children. Judge Brenner reviewed the psychological evaluations again. Dr. Hartman's assessment was unambiguous. Extreme risk for future violence, incapable of genuine empathy, no indication of conscience development, treatment resistant. Every clinical term pointed to the same conclusion. This wasn't a child who had made a catastrophic mistake. This was a child who had methodically planned a murder, executed it without hesitation, and felt satisfaction rather than remorse afterward. The fact that he was 12 didn't change what he was. It only made it more terrifying. She thought about Margaret Chen, a woman she had never met but had come to know intimately through testimony and evidence. A woman who had embodied everything good about humanity: selflessness, compassion, unconditional love. Margaret had believed that Ethan could be saved, had given him everything she had, and he had repaid her devotion with 47 stab wounds. Judge Brenner felt rage building in her chest, a hot coal of anger at the injustice of it all. Margaret Chen deserved justice. Her family deserved justice. And justice couldn't mean releasing her killer in 9 years simply because he had been young when he murdered her. But the weight of the decision pressed down on her. If she transferred Ethan to adult court, she would be sentencing a 12-year-old to adult prison. The precedent was significant. Other judges would look to this case when making similar decisions. Defense attorneys would argue it set a dangerous standard. Civil rights advocates would protest. The media would dissect every aspect of her reasoning. She would be criticized, probably vilified. Her decision would follow her for the rest of her career. But none of that mattered as much as one simple question. If Ethan Cole were released at 21, would someone else die? And could she live with herself if they did? She thought about her own grandchildren, 3 of them, ranging from 8 to 14. She thought about the trust that existed between them, how they climbed into her lap without fear, how they told her secrets and believed she would protect them. She couldn't imagine them hurting anyone, let alone planning a murder with such cold precision. But if one of them did, if one of them demonstrated the same complete absence of humanity that Ethan Cole showed, what would she want the system to do? Would she want that child released at 21? Would she trust that child around her other grandchildren? The answer was obvious and painful. Judge Brenner returned to the courtroom exactly 2 hours after she had left. The gallery filled quickly, people sensing that the decision was coming today rather than after days of deliberation. The speed of her return told them something significant. She hadn't agonized over evidence. She had agonized over courage. Whether she had the strength to do what the evidence demanded even when it contradicted everything she had believed about children and justice. When everyone was seated and the bailiff had called the court to order, Judge Brenner looked directly at Ethan Cole. He looked back with those empty eyes, still convinced that his age made him untouchable. She began by acknowledging the difficulty of the decision, that it had required her to weigh fundamental principles against undeniable reality. She reviewed the evidence systematically, the premeditation, the forensic findings, the psychological evaluations, the complete absence of remorse. She noted that the law recognized juveniles as categorically different from adults in most circumstances, that their capacity for rehabilitation was the cornerstone of the juvenile justice system. But she emphasized that the law also recognized exceptions, cases where the nature of the crime and the character of the offender warranted different treatment. Judge Brenner stated that she had considered the defense's arguments carefully, that Ethan's age and developmental status were significant factors. But she said that age could not be a shield for premeditated murder, that being 12 years old didn't erase the sophisticated planning that went into Margaret Chen's death, didn't erase the 3 weeks of research and preparation, didn't erase the decision to kill someone who loved him simply to satisfy curiosity. And most importantly, being 12 years old didn't erase the overwhelming evidence that Ethan Cole posed an ongoing threat to public safety that the juvenile system was not equipped to manage. She addressed Ethan directly for the first time, asked him if he had anything to say before she announced her decision. The courtroom held its breath. This was his last chance to show something. Anything. Remorse, fear, understanding. He looked at her with mild annoyance and said, "Not really." 2 words that sealed his fate. Not "I'm sorry," not "I wish I could take it back." Not even a strategic attempt to appear remorseful. Just, "Not really," as if the judge had asked if he wanted dessert. In that moment, whatever doubt remained in Judge Brenner's mind evaporated completely. She announced her decision. The case would be transferred to adult criminal court. Ethan Cole would be tried as an adult for first-degree murder. The courtroom erupted. Margaret's family sobbed with relief. Ethan's mother collapsed, her worst fear realized. Defense attorney Linda Marsh immediately stood to object, citing his age, but Judge Brenner cut her off. She said the decision was final and that appeals could be filed through the appropriate channels. Then she did something unusual. She explained her reasoning in detail, speaking not just to the people in the courtroom, but to the appeals courts that would inevitably review her decision. She said that the purpose of juvenile justice was rehabilitation, but rehabilitation required the capacity for change. Ethan Cole had been evaluated by multiple experts, all of whom concluded he lacked the emotional infrastructure necessary for genuine rehabilitation. She cited Dr. Hartman's testimony that treatment programs could teach him to mimic appropriate behavior, but couldn't create empathy where the biological capacity for it didn't exist. She noted that releasing him at 21, as would happen under juvenile jurisdiction, would place the public at significant risk based on every credible assessment of his psychology and behavior. Judge Brenner acknowledged that her decision would be controversial, that many would argue a 12-year-old should never face adult prosecution. But she posed a question. At what point does the nature of a crime and the danger posed by an offender outweigh the protections normally afforded by age? If a 12-year-old can plan a murder with adult-level sophistication, execute it with adult-level cruelty, and show adult-level callousness afterward, should the law ignore that reality simply because of a birth date? She argued that blind adherence to age as the sole determining factor would be a failure of justice, that each case must be evaluated on its specific facts, and the facts here were inescapable. She concluded by saying that her decision was not about punishment or vengeance. It was about protection, about ensuring that Margaret Chen's death would not be followed by other preventable tragedies, about recognizing that some individuals, regardless of age, cannot be safely managed through traditional juvenile interventions. She expressed hope that she was wrong, that Ethan Cole would prove everyone wrong and somehow develop the capacity for empathy and remorse. But hope could not be the basis for a decision that put public safety at risk. The law required her to make a decision based on evidence, and the evidence was overwhelming. Ethan Cole would be tried as an adult. The gavel fell. Ethan was remanded to custody pending adult trial. As bailiffs approached to escort him out, something changed in his expression. For the first time since his arrest, the smirk faltered. The casual confidence cracked. He looked at his mother, then at the judge, and for just a moment there was something in his eyes. Not remorse, not understanding, but fear. He had finally realized that his age wouldn't save him, that the system he had counted on to protect him had turned its back. He opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to finally show some emotion, but the bailiffs were already moving him toward the door. As he disappeared from the courtroom, Patricia Chen whispered, "Thank you." Judge Brenner nodded, but there was no triumph in her expression. Only the heavy weight of having made a decision that would define the rest of her career, and possibly save lives. 3 months passed between Judge Brenner's transfer decision and the beginning of Ethan Cole's adult trial. 3 months during which he sat in a juvenile facility, isolated from the general population for his own safety, slowly coming to terms with the fact that his life had irrevocably changed. The casual arrogance that had defined him began to show cracks, not because he had developed empathy or remorse, but because he had finally understood that consequences were real, that he couldn't smile his way out of this, that being 12 years old had failed to protect him the way he had assumed it would. Fear, it seemed, was the only emotion he was truly capable of feeling. The media coverage had been relentless. The case had become a national conversation about juvenile justice, child psychology, and the limits of rehabilitation. Legal experts debated Judge Brenner's decision on cable news. Some praised her courage in prioritizing public safety over abstract principles. Others condemned her for abandoning a child, arguing that the system had failed him long before he killed Margaret Chen. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse on the first day of trial. Some held signs demanding justice for Margaret, others held signs declaring that children should never face adult prosecution. The divide was stark, emotional, and seemingly unbridgeable. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was different from the transfer hearing. This was no longer about whether Ethan should be tried as an adult. That question had been answered. This was about guilt or innocence in the eyes of a jury. 12 citizens, carefully selected, who would determine whether the evidence proved beyond reasonable doubt that Ethan Cole had murdered his grandmother with premeditation and malice. The defense had no real strategy for creating doubt. The evidence was overwhelming. Instead, they would focus on mitigation, on painting Ethan as a deeply damaged child whose actions, while inexcusable, were the result of circumstances beyond his control. The jury selection had taken 2 full days. Finding 12 people who could fairly evaluate a child defendant in an adult murder trial was nearly impossible. Everyone had opinions. Everyone had biases. The prosecution wanted jurors who could look past Ethan's age and focus on his actions. The defense wanted jurors who would see a child first and a killer second. In the end, they settled on a mix. Teachers, parents, a retired social worker, a construction foreman, people who had experience with children but also understood that innocence wasn't guaranteed by youth. People who, hopefully, could navigate the moral complexity of the case. Assistant District Attorney Michael Reeves delivered his opening statement with the same measured precision he had shown during the transfer hearing. He told the jury that this case was not complicated. Ethan Cole had murdered Margaret Chen. The evidence would prove it beyond any doubt. Fingerprints, DNA, search history, text messages, confession. Everything pointed to the same conclusion. He acknowledged that Ethan's age would make the case emotionally difficult, that jurors would struggle with the idea of convicting a child. But he urged them to focus on the facts, on what Ethan had done, how he had done it, and why. The premeditation, the cruelty, the complete absence of remorse. Age didn't erase those realities. The defense's opening statement was delivered by a new attorney. Linda Marsh had asked to be removed from the case after the transfer decision, unable to continue representing a client she had come to fear. The new defense attorney, Robert Chen, no relation to Margaret, was a veteran public defender with a reputation for taking impossible cases. He stood before the jury and made an unusual acknowledgement. He said that Ethan Cole had killed Margaret Chen, that the defense would not dispute the facts of what happened. Instead, they would ask the jury to consider why it happened, to understand the life experiences that had shaped Ethan into someone capable of such violence, and ultimately to remember that he was still a child under the law, deserving of consideration that reflected his age and diminished capacity. The prosecution's case unfolded over 6 days. Forensic experts testified to the physical evidence. Detective Mendoza walked the jury through the investigation. Dr. Yao described the autopsy findings in clinical detail that made several jurors visibly uncomfortable. The photographs were shown again. Margaret's body, the blood-soaked kitchen, the knife that had ended her life. Each piece of evidence was entered methodically, building an undeniable narrative of premeditated murder. The jury took notes, asked questions through the judge, and slowly their expressions shifted from uncertainty to grim certainty. The most impactful testimony came from Marcus, Ethan's former friend. He was 13 now, older than when the murder occurred but still clearly a child. He sat in the witness box looking terrified, his mother in the front row for support. He recounted the conversations where Ethan had talked about killing his grandmother, the journal entries he had been shown, the text messages he had received on the morning of the murder. When the prosecution asked why he hadn't told an adult what Ethan was planning, Marcus broke down. He said he didn't think Ethan was serious, that kids say dramatic things all the time, that he never imagined someone their age could actually kill another person. His guilt was palpable. The jury watched with sympathy, but also with understanding. Even Ethan's closest friend had seen the darkness in him. The defense called fewer witnesses during their case. They had Dr. Mitchell Green testify again about juvenile brain development. They brought in Ethan's former caseworkers who described his chaotic early childhood. They presented Susan Cole one more time, though her testimony was even more devastating than before. She could barely look at her son. When asked if she believed he could be rehabilitated, she hesitated for so long that the judge prompted her to answer. Finally, in a voice barely audible, she said, "I don't know." A mother's inability to vouch for her own child spoke volumes. The jury noticed. The prosecution's rebuttal was brief but effective. They recalled Dr. Vanessa Hartman, who testified that while Ethan's childhood had been difficult, it didn't explain or excuse his actions. That plenty of children experienced neglect and trauma without becoming killers. That the psychological evaluations showed deficits that preceded any environmental factors. That Ethan's pathology was intrinsic, not learned. She emphasized again that he posed a significant ongoing threat and that no amount of intervention could create the emotional capacity he fundamentally lacked. Her testimony was damning, clinical, undeniable. Closing arguments were scheduled for the following day. But before the court adjourned, Judge Brenner asked Ethan if he wished to make a statement. It was unusual to offer this before closing arguments, but she wanted to give him one final opportunity to show the jury something human. To demonstrate that beneath the evidence and expert testimony was a child who understood the magnitude of what he had done. The courtroom went silent. Ethan's attorney whispered urgently in his ear, likely advising him to decline. But Ethan stood. He looked at the jury, and for a moment, everyone leaned forward, hoping for a breakthrough. He said that he didn't mean for things to turn out this way, that his grandmother had been nice to him, and he wished she wasn't dead. The words were right. The delivery was wrong. His tone was flat, practiced, like he was reading from a script someone had given him. There was no emotion behind the words, no tears, no trembling voice, just empty sounds shaped into a socially acceptable apology. One juror actually shook her head in disgust. Ethan seemed to sense he wasn't achieving the desired effect. He added that he was sorry and that he hoped people would forgive him. But again, the words rang hollow, like a child reciting multiplication tables rather than expressing genuine remorse. The prosecution didn't cross-examine. They didn't need to. Ethan's statement had done more damage to his case than anything they could have added. As he sat back down, his attorney put his head in his hands. The jury had just seen exactly what every expert had described, a child who intellectually understood he was supposed to feel remorse but had no actual capacity to experience it, who could say the right words but couldn't make them mean anything. It was chilling. And it was exactly what the prosecution needed the jury to see before they began deliberations. Ethan Cole had just sealed his own fate. Not with a confession of guilt, but with a demonstration of his fundamental inability to connect with human emotion. The trial was all but over. Justice was coming. The jury retired to deliberate at 10:45 on a Thursday morning. 12 ordinary people carrying an extraordinary burden. They filed into the deliberation room in silence, each lost in their own thoughts about what they had witnessed over the past 2 weeks. The evidence, the testimonies, the photographs that would haunt their dreams for years to come. And most disturbing of all, Ethan Cole himself. That small boy with empty eyes who had sat through his own murder trial as if he were watching paint dry. They had a decision to make. One that would determine not just Ethan's future, but would send a message about how society dealt with children who committed unthinkable acts. The jury foreman was a man named David Richardson, a high school history teacher with 23 years of experience working with adolescents. He had been elected foreman not because he was the loudest voice in the room, but because he was the most measured, the most willing to listen. As they settled around the long conference table, he asked everyone to take a moment before they began, to breathe, to center themselves. They were about to discuss something none of them had ever imagined facing: a 12-year-old murderer. The weight of it pressed down on all of them. They began with a preliminary vote, just to see where everyone stood. It wasn't binding, just a temperature check. David asked them to write guilty or not guilty on a slip of paper and fold it. He collected them, opened each one, and counted. 11 guilty, 1 not guilty. The room stirred with surprise. They had all sat through the same trial, heard the same evidence, seen the same photographs and video testimony. The case seemed straightforward. But one person had doubts. David asked if the dissenting juror wanted to explain their reasoning. A woman named Carol Martinez raised her hand hesitantly. Carol was 52, a mother of 4 and grandmother of 2. She worked as a nurse at a pediatric hospital where she saw sick children every day. She had cried multiple times during the trial, particularly during the victim impact statements. But she said she couldn't vote guilty. Not because she didn't believe Ethan had killed Margaret Chen. The evidence was undeniable. But because he was 12 years old. A child. She said that voting to convict him in adult court felt like giving up on the principle that children were different, that they deserved protection and the chance to change, even children who had done terrible things, even Ethan Cole. The discussion that followed was heated but respectful. Several jurors argued that Ethan had forfeited his right to be treated as a typical child the moment he planned and executed a murder, that his age didn't erase the sophistication of his crime or the danger he posed. A juror named Marcus Thompson, the construction foreman, said he had a 12-year-old son at home, that his son still believed in Santa Claus and cried when his goldfish died, that someone capable of stabbing their grandmother 47 times and feeling nothing wasn't a child in any meaningful sense. Age was just a number. Character was what mattered. But Carol held her ground. She brought up the testimony about Ethan's early childhood, the neglect, the substance abuse, the lack of stable attachment. She argued that no child was born a monster, that Ethan had been failed by the adults in his life long before he killed Margaret, that convicting him as an adult was society's way of washing its hands of responsibility for creating him. Another juror, a retired social worker named Helen Odom, gently disagreed. She said she had worked with neglected children for 30 years, that most of them became anxious, depressed, or struggled with relationships. They didn't become calculated killers. Ethan's pathology went beyond environmental factors. The deliberation continued through lunch, which was brought in by the bailiff. They ate in near silence, each juror wrestling with their own conscience. David Richardson finally asked Carol what it would take to change her mind. What evidence or argument could convince her that convicting Ethan was the right decision despite his age? Carol thought for a long time. Then she asked if they could review Dr. Hartman's testimony, specifically the part about whether Ethan could be rehabilitated. David sent a note to Judge Brenner requesting the transcript. Within an hour, they had it. They read Dr. Hartman's words together. Her assessment that Ethan lacked the biological capacity for empathy. That treatment could teach him to mimic appropriate responses but couldn't create genuine emotional connection. That he represented an extreme risk for future violence. That releasing him at any point would endanger the public. Carol read the words slowly, her finger tracing each line. When she finished, she sat back in her chair and closed her eyes. The room waited. Finally, she spoke. She said that if Ethan truly couldn't be rehabilitated, if he would remain dangerous regardless of intervention, then convicting him wasn't about punishment. It was about protection. And she couldn't prioritize her discomfort over public safety. But she had one more concern. She asked the jury to review Ethan's statement from the previous day, the one where he had apologized and said he wished his grandmother wasn't dead. Several jurors groaned, not wanting to revisit that moment. But Carol insisted. She said that if there was even a hint of genuine remorse in his words, she needed to see it. They requested the video. Judge Brenner approved. The screen was wheeled into the deliberation room, and they watched Ethan's statement together, paying attention to every detail. His posture, his tone, his facial expressions, the absence of any authentic emotion. When the video ended, Carol was crying. Not tears of sympathy for Ethan, but tears of recognition. She said she had worked in pediatrics long enough to know when a child was in genuine distress. She had seen children face terrifying diagnoses, painful procedures, and unimaginable loss. And every single one of them, no matter how brave they tried to be, showed real emotion. Fear, sadness, anxiety, something. But Ethan had shown nothing. Even when trying to appear remorseful, he couldn't access the emotion required to make it believable. Carol said she finally understood what the experts had been saying. Ethan Cole wasn't a damaged child who needed help. He was something fundamentally different, something that couldn't be fixed. David called for another vote. This time, the slips of paper were unanimous. 12 guilty verdicts. But the weight of that decision settled over them like a heavy blanket. They had just convicted a 12-year-old of first-degree murder. Regardless of how necessary it was, regardless of how much evidence supported it, the act itself felt momentous. Several jurors wept. Marcus Thompson said he would never forget this day as long as he lived. Helen Odom said she hoped they were making the right choice. Carol Martinez, who had held out the longest, said she believed they were. That sometimes protecting society meant making decisions that felt wrong on the surface but were necessary underneath. They sent word to Judge Brenner that they had reached a verdict. It had taken them 7 hours. 7 hours to navigate one of the most morally complex decisions any of them would ever face. As they filed back into the courtroom, the gallery was packed. News had spread that a verdict was imminent. Margaret's family sat in their usual spot, holding hands, praying for justice. Susan Cole sat alone on the other side, her face a mask of resignation. And Ethan sat at the defense table, his expression unreadable. If he was nervous about the verdict, he didn't show it. He simply stared at the jury as they took their seats, trying to read their faces. Judge Brenner asked if the jury had reached a verdict. David Richardson stood and confirmed they had. The bailiff retrieved the verdict form and handed it to the judge. She reviewed it silently, her expression neutral, then handed it back to the bailiff to return to the foreman. The courtroom was so quiet that the sound of paper rustling seemed deafening. Judge Brenner asked Ethan to stand. His attorney helped him to his feet. He was so small that even standing he barely reached his attorney's shoulder. The visual was jarring. A child facing adult consequences. But everyone in that room knew that appearances were deceiving. Judge Brenner asked the foreman to read the verdict. David Richardson cleared his throat, his hands trembling slightly as he held the paper. He read in a clear, steady voice, "We, the jury, in the case of the People versus Ethan Cole, find the defendant guilty of murder in the first degree." The courtroom erupted. Margaret's family sobbed with relief. Patricia Chen collapsed into her sister's arms, crying so hard her entire body shook. Ethan stood frozen for a moment, the word guilty seeming to register slowly. Then, for the first time since his arrest, his face showed genuine emotion. Not remorse, not regret, but shock. And beneath that, growing fear. He had truly believed until that moment that his age would save him, that the jury would see a child and find reasonable doubt where none existed. He had been wrong. Judge Brenner thanked the jury for their service and dismissed them. She set a sentencing hearing for 3 weeks later. As bailiffs moved to escort Ethan from the courtroom, he turned to look at his mother one last time. Susan met his eyes, and for a moment there was a flicker of connection between them. A mother looking at her son, a son realizing he would never go home again. But then Susan looked away, unable to hold his gaze. And Ethan was led out of the courtroom, his childhood officially over, his future reduced to concrete walls and bars. The verdict was in. Justice had been served, but the hardest part was yet to come. The sentence that would determine whether Ethan Cole spent decades or a lifetime paying for the murder of the woman who had loved him most. The 3 weeks between the guilty verdict and the sentencing hearing felt like an eternity for everyone involved. Margaret's family tried to find closure, knowing that justice was coming, but unable to fully grieve until they knew what that justice would look like. Susan Cole stopped coming to court appearances, unable to face the reality of what her son had become. And Ethan sat in juvenile detention, now convicted of first-degree murder, waiting to learn whether he would spend decades or the rest of his life in prison. The weight of that uncertainty seemed to finally penetrate his emotional armor. Guards reported that he barely spoke, barely ate. The arrogance that had defined him was crumbling, replaced by something that almost resembled fear. The media coverage intensified as the sentencing date approached. Legal analysts debated what sentence Judge Brenner should impose. Some argued for life without parole, citing the premeditation and brutality of the crime. Others argued that life without parole for a 12-year-old violated the Eighth Amendment's prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment. The Supreme Court had ruled in previous cases that mandatory life without parole for juveniles was unconstitutional, but they had left room for judges to impose such sentences in rare cases where the offender demonstrated irreparable corruption. Whether Ethan Cole met that standard would be Judge Brenner's decision to make. The courtroom was packed on the morning of the sentencing hearing, every seat filled. Media cameras lined the hallway outside. This wasn't just about Ethan Cole anymore. This had become a test case for how America dealt with child killers, for how the justice system balanced mercy with protection, for whether age alone was sufficient to shield someone from the harshest consequences when their crime demonstrated adult-level depravity. The tension in the room was palpable. Everyone knew they were witnessing a moment that would be studied in law schools and debated in ethics classes for generations. Judge Brenner entered at precisely 9 o'clock. She looked tired, as if the weight of this decision had stolen her sleep for weeks. She probably had. This wasn't a choice anyone could make lightly. She called the court to order and invited the prosecution to make their sentencing recommendation. Assistant District Attorney Michael Reeves stood, his expression grave. He recommended life in prison without the possibility of parole. His reasoning was methodical. The crime was heinous. The premeditation was extensive. The lack of remorse was absolute. And most importantly, every expert who had evaluated Ethan concluded he would remain dangerous indefinitely. Releasing him at any point would create an unacceptable risk to public safety. Reeves cited case law supporting life without parole for juvenile offenders in extreme circumstances. He argued that Ethan's case met every criterion for such a sentence. The murder was not impulsive or reactive. It was calculated and predatory. Ethan had demonstrated sophistication in planning that belied his age, and his complete absence of empathy indicated that no amount of time or treatment would fundamentally change who he was. Reeves concluded by reminding the court of Margaret Chen, of her kindness and her sacrifice, of the fact that she had given Ethan everything and he had repaid her with unspeakable violence. He said that any sentence less than life without parole would dishonor her memory and endanger future victims. The defense's sentencing recommendation was predictable but necessary. Robert Chen argued for a sentence that would allow for the possibility of parole after Ethan had served significant time. He acknowledged the severity of the crime but emphasized Ethan's age at the time. 12 years old. Still a child by every legal and biological measure. He cited studies showing that the adolescent brain continued developing into the mid-20s. That personality traits in childhood were not necessarily permanent. That even individuals with callous, unemotional traits could show improvement with intensive intervention. He argued that condemning a 12-year-old to die in prison was giving up on the possibility of change before change even had a chance to occur. Robert Chen also raised constitutional concerns. He argued that life without parole for someone so young violated evolving standards of decency, that the Supreme Court's prohibition on mandatory life without parole for juveniles reflected a broader understanding that children were different, that their crimes, however terrible, had to be evaluated through the lens of diminished culpability. He asked Judge Brenner to impose a lengthy sentence, perhaps 40 or 50 years, but one that gave Ethan the theoretical possibility of release if he demonstrated genuine rehabilitation. It was a plea for mercy tempered by reality. Even the defense knew that Ethan was unlikely to ever be safe for release, but they wanted him to have hope, a reason to try. Judge Brenner then invited victim impact statements. Patricia Chen was first. She walked to the podium slowly, her hands gripping a handwritten statement that trembled in her grasp. She talked about her sister, about the hole Margaret's death had left in their family, about how they would never hear her laugh again, never receive one of her handmade quilts, never taste her apple pie. She described attending Margaret's funeral and seeing the casket closed because the injuries were too extensive for an open viewing. She talked about nightmares where she heard her sister screaming for help that never came. And then she looked directly at Ethan. She said that Margaret had loved him more than anything in the world, that she had sacrificed her retirement, her savings, her peace of mind to give him a good life, that she had believed with her whole heart that he could be saved. Patricia's voice broke as she said that Margaret had been wrong, that some people couldn't be saved, that some people were born broken in ways that love couldn't fix. She told Judge Brenner that she didn't want revenge. She wanted protection. Protection for other potential victims. Protection for other grandmothers who might open their hearts to someone incapable of valuing that gift. She said that keeping Ethan locked away forever wasn't cruelty. It was mercy for everyone else. Other family members spoke, a nephew who described his aunt as the heart of their family, a cousin who talked about Margaret's faith and how she had believed everyone deserved second chances. Each statement reinforced the same message. Margaret Chen had been extraordinary. Her death had been preventable, and releasing her killer, regardless of his age at the time, would be a betrayal of everything she had stood for. The cumulative effect was devastating. Several jurors from the trial had returned to watch the sentencing, and many were crying openly. Then Susan Cole approached the podium. She hadn't been scheduled to speak, but she asked the judge for permission at the last moment. Judge Brenner allowed it, curious what this broken woman might say about her son. Susan stood there for a long moment staring at the piece of paper in her hands. Then she looked up at Ethan, who was watching her with those empty eyes. She said that she had failed him, that her addiction and neglect had stolen his chance at a normal childhood, that she would carry that guilt until the day she died. But then her voice hardened. She said that her failures didn't excuse what he had done, that plenty of children survived worse childhoods and didn't become murderers. Susan turned to address Judge Brenner directly. She said that she had spent 3 weeks trying to convince herself that her son could change, that somewhere inside him was a good person waiting to emerge. But she couldn't make herself believe it anymore. She had looked into his eyes too many times and seen nothing looking back. She said the hardest thing a mother could ever say, that she didn't recognize her son as human anymore, that whatever he was, it wasn't someone who could be trusted in society, and that if keeping him locked away forever was what it took to prevent another mother from losing her child, then that's what should happen. She apologized to Margaret's family. Then she left the courtroom, walking past Ethan without looking at him again. The devastation of a mother giving up on her child hung heavy in the air. Judge Brenner asked Ethan if he wished to make a statement before sentencing. His attorney advised against it, but Ethan insisted. He stood, smaller than ever in his oversized suit, and faced the judge. For a moment it seemed like he might finally say something real, something that came from a place of genuine understanding. Instead, he read from a prepared statement that his attorney had written. He said he was sorry for what he had done, that he wished he could take it back, that he hoped someday people would forgive him. The words were appropriate. The delivery was mechanical, like a student reading a book report on a novel he hadn't actually read. But then Ethan went off script. He put down the paper and spoke in his own words. He said that everyone kept saying he didn't feel bad about what happened, that he was a monster. But they were wrong. He did feel bad. He felt bad that he got caught. He felt bad that his life was ruined. He felt bad that people were calling him names and treating him like he was evil. His attorney tried to stop him, but Ethan kept talking. He said it wasn't fair that he was being punished so harshly when he was just a kid, that other kids did bad things and didn't go to prison forever, that his grandmother had been old anyway and would have died eventually, so why did it matter so much? The courtroom gasped. Ethan seemed to realize he had said something wrong, but he didn't understand what. He looked confused by the reactions around him. His attorney pulled him back into his seat, whispering urgently, but the damage was done. In trying to defend himself, Ethan had confirmed everything the prosecution had argued. He didn't feel remorse for killing Margaret. He felt annoyed that he was being held accountable. He saw himself as the victim, the real victim, not the woman whose life he had stolen, but the boy whose consequences were inconveniencing him. Judge Brenner's expression hardened into something resembling granite. Whatever doubt might have remained evaporated in that moment. Ethan Cole had just sentenced himself. Judge Marion Brenner sat silently for a full minute after Ethan's statement concluded. The courtroom remained frozen, everyone processing what they had just witnessed. A 12-year-old convicted murderer had stood before the court and revealed in his own words that he viewed himself as the victim, that his grandmother's death mattered less than the inconvenience of his punishment, that her age somehow diminished the value of her life. It was a level of depravity that transcended anything the psychological experts had described. It was evil in its purest, most distilled form, and it had come from the mouth of a child. Judge Brenner finally spoke. Her voice was steady but carried an edge of steel that made everyone in the courtroom sit up straighter. She said that in her 19 years on the bench, she had never encountered a case quite like this one, that she had presided over hundreds of juvenile cases and had always believed in the fundamental premise that children were different, that they deserved second chances, that rehabilitation was possible even for those who had committed serious crimes. But she said that belief had been challenged by Ethan Cole in ways she never anticipated, that sometimes, rarely but undeniably, a young person demonstrated a level of depravity that made age irrelevant. She reviewed the facts of the case systematically. The 3 weeks of planning, the internet searches on how to avoid detection, the journal entries expressing his intent, the selection of the most vulnerable person in his life as his victim, the 47 stab wounds that demonstrated sustained rage and commitment to killing, the attempt to cover up the crime, the confession where he admitted doing it out of curiosity, and finally, today's statement where he made clear that his only regret was getting caught. Judge Brenner said that each fact alone was disturbing. Together they painted an undeniable picture of someone who posed a permanent threat to society. She addressed the defense's arguments about brain development and the possibility of change. She acknowledged that adolescent brains were still maturing, that personality traits could shift as individuals grew older, but she emphasized that multiple experts had evaluated Ethan and reached the same conclusion. His deficit wasn't in the reasoning centers of his brain that would continue developing. It was in the emotional centers that created empathy, remorse, and moral conscience. Those deficits appeared to be permanent, and no amount of therapy or intervention had shown promise for creating emotional capacity where the biological foundation for it didn't exist. Judge Brenner then addressed the constitutional questions about sentencing juveniles to life without parole. She cited the Supreme Court's guidance that such sentences should be reserved for rare cases where the juvenile offender demonstrated irreparable corruption. She said that term had always troubled her. It seemed harsh, final. But looking at Ethan Cole, Hearing his own words, reviewing the extensive psychological evaluations, she understood what the Supreme Court had meant. Some individuals, even young ones, were fundamentally incapable of the change that rehabilitation required. Ethan Cole was one of those individuals. His corruption, for lack of a better term, was complete and irreparable. She said that her decision was not about punishment or vengeance. It was about protection, about ensuring that what happened to Margaret Chen would never happen to anyone else, about recognizing that some threats couldn't be managed through supervision or treatment. They could only be contained. She acknowledged that sentencing a 12-year-old to life without parole was extraordinary, that it would generate controversy and criticism, that some would view it as abandoning a child. But she said that protecting future victims had to take precedence over abstract principles about redemption, that her obligation was to society as a whole, not to the feelings of those who wanted to believe every child could be saved. Judge Brenner looked directly at Ethan. She asked him if he understood what she was about to do. He nodded, but his expression suggested he still didn't fully grasp the finality of what was coming. She took a breath and delivered the sentence that would define both their legacies. Ethan Cole, you have been found guilty by a jury of your peers of murder in the first degree. After careful consideration of all evidence, expert testimony, and your own statements, I hereby sentence you to life in prison without the possibility of parole. You will be transferred to the state correctional system where you will remain for the rest of your natural life. This sentence is not subject to reduction for good behavior or any other reason. You will die in prison. The courtroom exploded. Margaret's family erupted in tears and embraces. Patricia Chen fell to her knees, sobbing with relief. Civil rights advocates in the gallery shouted that this was cruel and unusual punishment, that children should never receive such sentences. Reporters rushed to file updates, and Ethan sat frozen at the defense table, the words finally penetrating. Life without parole. No possibility of release. Never going home. Never having a normal life. Never walking free. For the first time in the entire proceeding, genuine emotion crossed his face. Not remorse, not understanding, but panic. Raw, animal panic. He turned to his attorney and said, "She can't do that. I'm just a kid." His attorney had no response. But Judge Brenner wasn't finished. She continued speaking, her voice cutting through the chaos. She said that her sentence came with a recommendation, that Ethan should be placed in a facility equipped to handle juvenile lifers, that he should have access to education and mental health services, not because she believed he would change, but because the law required humane treatment even for those serving life sentences. She said that he would be eligible for review after 25 years, not for release, but to determine whether his security level could be reduced if he demonstrated no disciplinary issues. It was a small concession to those who believed in the theoretical possibility of change, but it was clear from her tone that she expected no such change to occur. She then addressed the appellate courts that would inevitably review her decision. She stated her findings clearly for the record, that Ethan Cole demonstrated permanent antisocial personality traits with callous, unemotional features, that multiple experts had concluded he posed an extreme risk for future violence, that he lacked the capacity for genuine remorse or behavioral change, that his crime was committed with adult-level premeditation and sophistication, that he had been afforded every protection and consideration appropriate for a juvenile defendant, and that despite all of that, the only just sentence given the totality of circumstances was life without parole. She said her decision was supported by law, evidence, and moral necessity. She invited appeal but expressed confidence that her sentence would be upheld. Judge Brenner then did something unexpected. She addressed the public directly, speaking to the cameras she knew were recording every word. She said that this case should serve as a wake-up call, that society needed better systems for identifying children with dangerous psychological profiles before they acted violently. That early intervention, while unlikely to create empathy where none existed, might at least provide supervision that prevented tragedies. She said that Margaret Chen's death was preventable if the warning signs had been taken seriously. The killed cat, the stolen money, the violent drawings, the escalating cruelty, all of it had been dismissed as normal childhood behavior when it was anything but normal. She called for better training for teachers, caseworkers, and family members to recognize the difference between a troubled child and a dangerous one. She acknowledged that such distinctions were difficult and that most children displaying concerning behavior were not future killers. But she said the cost of missing the truly dangerous ones was too high. Margaret Chen had paid that cost with her life. Future potential victims shouldn't have to pay it because society was too uncomfortable to acknowledge that some children were born without the capacity for empathy. That uncomfortable truth needed to be faced if more tragedies were to be prevented. Judge Brenner's gavel fell. This court is adjourned. Bailiffs moved to escort Ethan from the courtroom. He stood on shaky legs, his face pale, his earlier arrogance completely shattered. As he was led toward the door, he turned back one last time. His eyes scanned the courtroom, perhaps looking for his mother who wasn't there. They landed on Patricia Chen, who was still weeping in the front row. For just a moment their eyes met. Patricia expected to see hatred or defiance. Instead, she saw fear. Pure, primal fear. The reality of what life without parole meant was finally sinking in. He would never leave prison. Never have a family. Never experience freedom. He would grow old and die behind bars. And in that moment of fear, he looked like what he was, a 12-year-old child. But it was too late for that image to save him. As Ethan disappeared through the door that would separate him from the free world forever, Patricia whispered something that only those closest to her heard. "Margaret, he can't hurt anyone else now. You can rest." The courtroom slowly emptied. Reporters rushed to file stories. Legal experts began analyzing the sentence, and Judge Marion Brenner sat alone at her bench for a long moment before retiring to her chambers. She had just made the most controversial decision of her career, had sentenced a child to die in prison. Some would call her a hero, others would call her a monster, but she knew with absolute certainty that she had made the right choice. Because justice wasn't about feeling good. It was about doing what was necessary to protect the innocent. And today, justice had been served. The days following Ethan Cole's sentencing felt surreal for everyone involved. The case that had consumed their lives for months was suddenly over, the verdict delivered, the sentence imposed. But the emotional aftermath lingered like smoke after a fire. Margaret's family tried to move forward, carrying the weight of their loss, but finding some measure of peace in knowing that justice had been done. Susan Cole disappeared from public view entirely, relocating to another state where no one knew her story. And Ethan began his life sentence at a secure juvenile facility that housed the state's youngest lifers, beginning a journey that would end only with his death behind bars. The media coverage was unprecedented. The case became a flashpoint in the national conversation about juvenile justice. Cable news devoted entire segments to debating Judge Brenner's decision. Legal scholars argued both sides passionately. Some praised her courage in prioritizing public safety over sentimentality about childhood. They pointed to the extensive evidence of Ethan's dangerousness and argued that age alone couldn't shield someone from appropriate consequences when they demonstrated adult-level depravity. Others condemned the sentence as cruel and unusual punishment, arguing that no 12-year-old should be condemned to die in prison regardless of their crime. They cited brain development research and maintained that children were categorically different from adults in ways that demanded different treatment. Civil rights organizations filed appeals almost immediately. They argued that life without parole for a 12-year-old violated the Eighth Amendment, that it contradicted the Supreme Court's recognition that children possessed diminished culpability and greater capacity for change. The appeals worked their way through the system, each level of court reviewing Judge Brenner's decision with intense scrutiny. But at every stage, the sentence was upheld. Appellate judges acknowledged the extraordinary nature of the case, but found that Judge Brenner had acted within her discretion. The evidence supporting Ethan's permanent dangerousness was overwhelming. The psychological evaluations were unanimous, and his own statements, particularly his remarks at sentencing, demonstrated a level of callousness that justified the harshest penalty. Margaret's family tried to reclaim some normalcy. Patricia Chen became an advocate for victims' rights, speaking at conferences and working with legislators to strengthen protections for vulnerable populations. She established a foundation in Margaret's name that provided resources for grandparents raising grandchildren, offering support systems that Margaret never had. Patricia channeled her grief into action, determined that her sister's death would result in something positive. She spoke openly about the case, always emphasizing that Margaret had been a real person with hopes and dreams and value, not just a statistic in a sensational murder trial. The psychological community studied Ethan's case extensively. Dr. Vanessa Hartman published papers on callous, unemotional traits in juveniles, using Ethan as a case study in permanent antisocial pathology. Other researchers examined what went wrong, trying to identify the warning signs that had been missed or ignored. The consensus was troubling. Ethan had shown red flags from early childhood: the lack of attachment, the cruelty to animals, the absence of empathy, the manipulative behavior. But each sign alone had seemed manageable. It was only in retrospect that the pattern became clear. The research led to new screening tools and training programs designed to help identify truly dangerous children before they acted on their violent impulses. Schools began implementing programs based on lessons learned from the case. Teachers received training on recognizing the difference between normal childhood aggression and genuine psychological pathology. Child Protective Services revised their assessment protocols to better identify children who posed risks to others, not just children at risk themselves. The changes came too late for Margaret Chen, but they potentially saved future victims. Ethan's case, as horrific as it was, became a catalyst for systemic improvements that might prevent similar tragedies. It was small comfort to those who had loved Margaret, but it was something. Susan Cole never spoke publicly about her son again. Those who knew her said she lived with crushing guilt, tormented by questions about what she could have done differently. Should she have gotten sober earlier? Should she have recognized the signs that something was fundamentally wrong with Ethan? Should she have never had a child in the first place, given her struggles? The questions had no satisfying answers. Some children born into terrible circumstances grew up to be kind, functional adults. Others born into loving homes became dangerous. The relationship between nature and nurture remained complex and unpredictable. Susan's tragedy was that she would spend the rest of her life wondering if she had created the monster her son became, or if he had been born that way, doomed from the start. Inside the juvenile facility, Ethan adjusted to his new reality slowly. The other young inmates feared him once they learned about his case. Even among children who had committed serious crimes, killing your own grandmother was seen as especially heinous. He was isolated much of the time for his own protection. Guards reported that he was quiet, compliant with rules, but emotionally flat. He attended the mandatory education classes without enthusiasm or resistance. He met with therapists who tried various interventions, but progress was non-existent. He could articulate what he was supposed to feel: guilt, remorse, regret. But he couldn't actually experience those emotions. The therapy sessions became perfunctory exercises in going through motions that everyone knew were pointless. As months turned into years, Ethan aged but didn't mature in the ways that mattered. He grew taller, his voice deepened, his body changed from child to adolescent, but the emptiness behind his eyes remained constant. Psychologists who evaluated him annually found no development of empathy, or moral reasoning. He understood intellectually that what he had done was considered wrong by society, but he couldn't internalize why it was wrong. To him, Margaret's death was simply a thing that happened, an event that had consequences for him personally, but not something that carried moral weight. The experts who had predicted he couldn't change were proven correct year after year. Judge Marion Brenner's career continued, but the Ethan Cole case became her defining legacy. Some lawyers and judges praised her decision as a courageous application of justice over sentiment. Others criticized her as harsh and punitive, arguing she had betrayed the principles of juvenile justice. She received death threats from people who viewed the sentence as child abuse. She also received letters of gratitude from victims' advocates who believed she had protected future victims. Judge Brenner rarely discussed the case publicly, but those close to her said she never regretted her decision. She had reviewed the evidence, consulted the experts, and made the choice that protected society. That was her job. The controversy was secondary to the duty. The case influenced legislation across the country. Some states tightened restrictions on trying juveniles as adults, viewing Ethan's sentence as an aberration that needed to be prevented. Other states expanded judicial discretion, believing that judges needed flexibility to address extreme cases that didn't fit standard categories. The juvenile justice system remained divided between those who believed children were always redeemable and those who recognized that rare exceptions existed. Ethan Cole became the example cited by both sides, proof either that the system had failed a child or that the system had successfully protected society from an irredeemable predator. Margaret Chen's grave became a quiet place of reflection. Fresh flowers appeared regularly, left by family members and sometimes by strangers who had been moved by her story. Her headstone bore a simple inscription, "Beloved teacher, sister, grandmother." Her love knew no bounds. Patricia visited weekly, sitting on the grass beside the grave and talking to her sister about life, about the Foundation's work, about the slow process of healing. She often wondered what Margaret would think about Ethan's sentence. Would she have wanted mercy for the boy she had loved? Or would she have understood the necessity of protecting others from him? Patricia believed her sister would have been heartbroken, but accepting. Margaret had always wanted to believe the best in people, but she was also practical. She would have grieved for the child Ethan could have been while acknowledging the danger of the person he actually was. 25 years would pass before Ethan's first review hearing, the milestone Judge Brenner had mentioned where his security classification might be reconsidered. But everyone involved understood that review was perfunctory. Ethan Cole would never walk free. He would grow old behind bars, his entire adult life defined by a choice he made at 12 years old. Some would view that as tragedy. Others would view it as justice. Perhaps it was both. The tragedy of a child born without the capacity for empathy, meeting the justice demanded by a brutal murder. There were no winners in this story, only survivors trying to find meaning in senseless violence. The case of Ethan Cole became a touchstone in criminal justice discussions for decades. It raised questions that had no easy answers. At what age does someone become fully accountable for their actions? Can evil exist in someone so young? Is rehabilitation possible for individuals who lack fundamental emotional capacity? Where is the line between protecting childhood and protecting society? Different people answered those questions differently based on their values, experiences, and beliefs about human nature. But everyone who studied the case agreed on one thing. Margaret Chen had deserved better. She had deserved to grow old in peace, surrounded by love, her sacrifices appreciated rather than repaid with violence. The final gavel had fallen. The sentence had been served. But the echoes of that March morning when a 12-year-old boy stabbed his grandmother 47 times continued to reverberate. In courtrooms where judges weighed juvenile sentences, in therapy offices where psychologists evaluated troubled children, in homes where grandparents raised grandchildren and prayed they would never face what Margaret faced. The story of Ethan Cole and Margaret Chen became a reminder that love couldn't always save people, that sometimes the system had to step in and do what love couldn't accomplish, protect the innocent from those incapable of valuing human life. It was a hard truth, an uncomfortable truth, but truth nonetheless. And in the end, justice had been served, cold, final, and necessary. The kind of justice that left no one feeling triumphant, only relieved that one dangerous person could hurt no one else ever again.